Some people believe that fate is written in the stars long before a person is ever born. Others say that life is nothing but a series of accidents, random moments crashing into each other like stones tumbling down a mountain. But every once in a while, something happens that is so strange, so impossible, so perfectly timed, that it makes even the biggest doubters stop and wonder. This is one of those stories. It is the story of a girl who lost everything, a warrior who followed his heart against every warning, and a single moment on a dusty auction platform that changed the course of two lives forever. What happened between them was not written in any history book. No scholar recorded it. No newspaper printed it. But the people who were there that day never forgot it, and now, neither will you. The sun was brutal that morning. It hung low and heavy over the trading post like a giant ball of fire, turning the sand into something that could burn through the bottom of a boot. The air smelled like dust and sweat and animal hide. Flies buzzed around in lazy circles, landing on the faces of men who were too tired or too drunk to swat them away. It was the kind of day that made people mean. The kind of day that made tempers short and patience thin. And it was on this exact kind of day, in a forgotten corner of the American Southwest, sometime in the early 1800s, that a slave auction was about to begin. The trading post sat at the edge of nowhere. It was a rough collection of wooden buildings and open corrals surrounded by nothing but flat, dry land that stretched out in every direction until it met the sky. Traders came here from all over, Spanish merchants from the south, mountain men from the north, Comanche raiders, Ute warriors, Mexican dealers, and sometimes, though not often, Navajo riders who came down from their Red Rock homeland looking for horses, tools, or supplies they could not make themselves. On this particular morning, a crowd had already gathered near the raised wooden platform at the center of the post. It was not a large platform, just a few planks nailed together and set on top of some barrels so that whoever stood on it could be seen by everyone in the crowd. It had been used to sell horses, blankets, weapons, and barrels of whiskey, but today it was being used for something else. Today it was being used to sell human beings. This was not unusual for the time and the place. The slave trade in the Southwest was a dark and ugly business that had been going on for generations. Long before the Americans pushed west, long before the Mexican government claimed this land, the buying and selling of captives had been a part of life in this region. Tribes raided other tribes. Villages were attacked. Women and children were taken. And then they were sold, traded like livestock at posts just like this one. It was a terrible system built on suffering, and it touched every group of people who lived in this vast and unforgiving land. The man running the auction that day was a trader named Castellano. He was a thick, barrel-chested man with a black beard that was streaked with grey and eyes that never seemed to blink. He had been in the business for over 20 years. He knew how to read a crowd. He knew how to drive up a price. And he knew how to keep his merchandise quiet and obedient. He carried a short leather whip on his belt. Not because he used it often, but because the sight of it was usually enough. Castellano had brought 7 captives to sell that morning. 5 of them were children, ranging in age from about 6 to 12. They were Apache, taken during a raid on a small camp near the river 3 weeks earlier. They stood together in a tight little group behind the platform, their hands bound with rough rope, their eyes wide with a fear that went beyond words. 2 older women stood beside them. They had stopped crying days ago. Now they simply stared at the ground, waiting for whatever was going to happen next. But there was one more. And she was different from the rest. She stood apart from the others, near the edge of the platform, her wrists tied in front of her with a strip of rawhide. She was young, probably no more than 19 or 20 years old. Her hair was long and black and fell past her shoulders like a dark waterfall. Her skin was the color of warm copper, and even though she was covered in trail dust and her clothes were torn, there was something about her that made people look twice. It was not just that she was beautiful, though she certainly was. It was something else. Something in the way she held herself. Her back was straight. Her chin was up. Her eyes, dark and deep, did not look at the ground like the others. They looked straight ahead, burning with a fire that captivity had not been able to put out. No one knew her real name. The traders called her different things. Castellano simply called her the girl. But she had a name. She had a family. She had a home. And all of it had been ripped away from her in a single night of blood and fire that she would never be able to forget. Her village had been small. A quiet place nestled in a valley where a narrow stream cut through the rocks and fed a strip of green land where her people grew corn and beans. They were a peaceful group, not warriors, not raiders. Just families trying to live their lives in a land that did not make living easy. Her father had been the leader of the village, a calm, steady man who settled disputes with words instead of weapons. Her mother had been known for her weaving. She could make blankets so fine and so colorful that traders would travel for days just to buy one. The girl had grown up in that valley, surrounded by love and laughter and the sound of the stream running over the rocks. She had learned to grind corn with her mother. She had learned the old songs from her grandmother. She had watched the stars at night and believed, the way children believe, that the world was a safe and beautiful place. She was wrong. The raiders came on a night when the moon was full and bright. They came on horseback, fast and silent, appearing out of the darkness like ghosts. By the time the first scream rang out, it was already too late. The village had no walls, no watchtower, no warriors standing guard. The people had been asleep in their homes, dreaming whatever dreams they had, when the world exploded into chaos. The girl remembered the sound of hooves pounding the earth. She remembered the orange glow of fire as the homes were set ablaze. She remembered her father shouting for everyone to run. She remembered reaching for her mother's hand and feeling it slip away. She remembered running through the smoke and the screaming and the terrible sounds of violence, running until her lungs burned and her legs gave out and she fell face first into the dirt. And then there were hands on her, rough hands, strong hands. Hands that grabbed her arms and pulled her up and threw her over the back of a horse. She fought. She kicked and scratched and bit, but it was useless. The rider was too strong. And as the horse carried her away from the burning village, she looked back over her shoulder and saw everything she had ever known disappearing into smoke and flame. She did not know what happened to her father. She did not know what happened to her mother. She did not know if anyone had survived. All she knew was that she was alone, and she was being taken somewhere she did not want to go. The raiders took her south. They rode for days, stopping only when the horses needed rest. They fed her scraps of dried meat and let her drink from the water skins when they remembered. At night, they tied her to a tree or a stake driven into the ground. They did not hurt her beyond what was necessary to keep her moving. She was merchandise to them. Damaged goods were worth less. After about a week of riding, they reached another camp. This was bigger than anything she had seen before. There were dozens of tents and shelters, hundreds of horses, and people everywhere. She could hear different languages being spoken. She could smell cooking fires and tanned leather and something sweet that she could not identify. This was a gathering place, a hub where different groups came together to trade and negotiate and settle scores. It was here that she was sold for the first time. The raiders traded her to a Comanche chief in exchange for 6 horses and a pile of Spanish silver coins. The chief kept her for several weeks, during which time she worked from dawn to dark, hauling water, gathering firewood, scraping hides, and doing whatever else she was told. The work was hard, but the chief's wife was not cruel to her. She gave her decent food and a blanket to sleep under, and did not beat her unless she was too slow with her tasks. But then the chief decided he needed more guns, and so the girl was traded again, this time to a Mexican trader who was passing through on his way north. The trader put her in the back of a wagon with 3 other captives and drove them across the dry plains for another week until they reached the trading post where Castellano was waiting. Castellano looked her over the way a horse trader looks over a new animal. He checked her teeth. He examined her hands. He made her walk back and forth so he could see if she was lame. Then he nodded and handed the Mexican trader a leather pouch filled with coins. And just like that, she changed hands again. Now here she was, standing near the edge of that rough wooden platform on the hottest morning of the year, waiting to be sold to whoever offered the most money. She had been sold 3 times already, each time to a stranger. Each time to someone who saw her as nothing more than a thing to be owned. And each time, a little piece of her had died inside. But not all of it. Not. Because somewhere deep down, in a place that the raiders and the traders and the chains could not reach, there was still a spark, a tiny, stubborn flame that refused to go out. It whispered to her in the quiet hours of the night. It told her that this was not the end, that her story was not over, that something was coming. She did not know what. She did not know when, but she believed it. She had to, because without that belief, she had nothing. The crowd around the platform was growing. Men pushed and shoved for a better view. Arguments broke out over standing room. Castellano climbed up onto the platform and raised his hands for silence. He was good at this. He knew how to build excitement. He started with the children, selling them one by one to the highest bidder. The prices were low. Children were cheap. They required feeding and years of training before they were useful. Most of the buyers were ranchers who needed extra hands for their herds. A few were women who had lost their own children and wanted someone to raise. The two older women went next. They sold quickly and without much competition. A Spanish landowner bought one. A mountain man bought the other. Neither woman reacted when the sale was made. They simply walked to their new owners with empty eyes and heavy steps like animals being led to a pen. And then it was her turn. Castellano reached down and pulled her up onto the platform. The crowd went quiet for a moment. Then the murmuring started. Men leaned forward. Eyes widened. Even in her dusty, torn clothing, even with her wrists bound and her face streaked with dirt, the girl was stunning. There was no other word for it. She stood on that platform like a queen standing before her court. Her back straight, her chin up, her dark eyes scanning the crowd with a defiance that both thrilled and unnerved the men looking back at her. Castellano grinned. He knew he had something special. He started the bidding high, much higher than he had started with any of the others, and immediately hands went up. The Spanish landowner wanted her. The mountain men wanted her. A Ute trader shouted a number. A Mexican rancher shouted a higher one. The price climbed and climbed, and Castellano's grin grew wider and wider. But then, from the back of the crowd came a voice that cut through all the others like a knife through cloth. It was deep and strong, and carried an authority that made every head turn. "I will take her." The crowd parted, and a man stepped forward. He was tall, taller than most of the men there, with broad shoulders and a chest that looked like it had been carved from stone. His skin was dark brown, weathered by sun and wind. His hair was long and black, tied back with a strip of red cloth. He wore a simple tunic of deerskin and leggings that were worn but clean. Around his neck hung a string of turquoise beads that caught the light and threw tiny blue sparks into the air. He was Navajo. That much was obvious from his clothing and his bearing, and he was not the kind of man anyone wanted to argue with. His name was Ahiga. In the Navajo language, it meant he fights, and the name fit him well. He was a warrior from a respected clan, a man who had earned his reputation through years of courage and skill. He had fought raiders. He had hunted wolves. He had survived winters that killed weaker men. He was 32 years old, and he had come to the trading post that morning for one reason and one reason only. He needed a new saddle for his horse. He had not come to buy a slave. He had not come to attend an auction. He had not planned on spending a single coin on anything other than leather and tools. But then he had heard the commotion near the platform. He had walked over to see what was happening. And the moment he saw her standing up there, something had shifted inside him, something he could not explain and did not try to. It was like a bolt of lightning had struck him from a clear sky. His heart had stopped. His breath had caught in his throat, and before he even knew what he was doing, the words had come out of his mouth. "I will take her." Castellano stared at him. Even the girl on the platform turned her head and looked at him with those burning dark eyes. Ahiga reached into the leather bag at his side and pulled out everything he had: silver coins, turquoise stones, a beautifully crafted knife with a bone handle. He held it all out in his open palms and looked at Castellano with a steady gaze that said he was not interested in negotiating. Castellano looked at what was being offered. He did the math in his head. It was more than any other bidder had offered. Much more. He shrugged, nodded, and waved his hand. The deal was done. Ahiga walked to the platform. He reached up and took the girl by the arm, gently, not roughly the way the others had handled her. He helped her step down from the platform. Then he pulled the knife from his belt and cut the rawhide binding her wrists. She looked at him. He looked at her. The crowd watched in silence. And in that moment, on that dusty, brutal morning, something began. Neither of them knew what it was yet. Neither of them understood where it would lead. But the spark was there. Tiny. Fragile. Real. Ahiga turned and walked toward the edge of the trading post where his horse was tied. The girl stood for a moment, rubbing her wrists where the rawhide had left raw red marks. Then, slowly, she followed him. Not because she had to, not because she was afraid, but because something inside her, that same stubborn flame that had kept her alive through all the horror and the loss, told her that this was different. She did not know if she was right, She did not know if this man would be kind or cruel, gentle or harsh. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, or the day after that. All she knew was that she was still alive, and for now that was enough. The ride from the trading post took 3 days. 3 long, silent days, across a landscape that seemed to have no end. Red rock formations rose up from the desert floor like giant fingers reaching toward the sky. Dry riverbeds wound through the land like scars on old skin. The wind blew constantly, picking up sand and throwing it against their faces until their eyes burned and their lips cracked. It was harsh country, unforgiving country. But it was also beautiful in a way that was hard to put into words. The colors changed with the light. At dawn, the rocks glowed pink and orange. At midday, they turned a deep, angry red. And at sunset, the whole world seemed to catch fire, the sky exploding into shades of purple and gold that made even the most hardened travelers stop and stare. Ahigar rode in front on his horse, a strong, dark animal with a white blaze on its forehead. The girl walked behind. He had offered to let her ride, but she had shaken her head without saying a word. She preferred to walk. It gave her a sense of control. As long as her feet were on the ground, she felt like she could run if she needed to. She did not trust this man. She did not trust anyone. Trust was something that had been burned out of her along with her village and her family and everything else she had ever loved. For those 3 days, they barely spoke. Ahiga tried a few times. He pointed at things along the trail and said their Navajo names. A hawk circling overhead. A cluster of yellow wildflowers growing in the crack of a rock. A distant mesa that looked like a sleeping giant. He spoke in a calm, easy voice, the way someone might talk to a nervous horse, not demanding anything, not expecting a response, just filling the silence with something other than the sound of the wind. The girl said nothing. She watched him from behind with careful eyes, studying the way he moved, the way he handled his horse, the way he scanned the horizon every few minutes looking for signs of danger. She noticed that he never raised his voice. He never made sudden movements. He never looked at her the way the other men at the trading post had looked at her, with hunger and ownership in their eyes. He looked at her the way someone might look at a wounded bird, with concern and something that might have been sadness. On the first night, he made camp in a sheltered spot between 2 large boulders. He built a small fire, careful to keep it low so the smoke would not be seen from a distance. He cooked dried venison and cornmeal over the flames and set a portion aside for her on a flat stone. Then he moved to the other side of the fire and ate his own meal in silence. He did not tie her hands. He did not tie her to anything. He simply ate, cleaned his knife, and rolled himself in his blanket with his back to her. She sat there for a long time, staring at the food on the stone. Her stomach was screaming. She had not eaten a proper meal in days. But accepting his food felt like accepting something more. It felt like agreeing to something she had not yet decided to agree to. She sat there, torn between pride and hunger, while the fire crackled and the stars wheeled slowly overhead. Eventually, hunger won. She picked up the food and ate it quickly, wiping her hands on her torn clothing when she was done. She looked across the fire at the shape of the man sleeping on the other side. He had not moved. His breathing was slow and even. He was either asleep or very good at pretending. She pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapped her arms around them, and closed her eyes. She did not sleep. Not really, but she rested, and for the first time in a long time, she rested without her hands being tied. On the second day, she noticed something that surprised her. Ahiga stopped beside a stream to water his horse. While the animal drank, he knelt beside the water and washed his face and hands. Then he stood up, cupped water in his palms, and brought it to her, not in a cup or a container. In his hands. The water dripped between his fingers as he held it out to her, and there was something so simple and so human about the gesture that it cracked something open inside her chest. She looked at his hands. They were large and calloused, scarred from years of hard work and hard fighting, but they were steady and gentle, and they were offering her something instead of taking something away from her. She leaned forward and drank from his cupped palms. The water was cold and clean and tasted like the mountains it came from. When she lifted her head, a single drop ran down her chin. Their eyes met. And for just a moment, the smallest fraction of a second, something passed between them. It was not love. Not yet. It was recognition. The recognition of one wounded soul seeing another. Then the moment passed. Ahiga turned back to his horse, and they continued on their way. On the third day, they reached Navajo land. The change was not sudden. There was no border, no fence, no sign. But the land itself seemed to shift. The flat, dry desert gave way to rolling hills covered in sage and juniper. Mesas rose in the distance, their flat tops dusted with green. A river appeared, wider and deeper than any stream they had crossed, its water brown with silt but full of life. Birds flew along its banks, trees grew along its edges. And in the distance, barely visible through the haze, she could see the dark shapes of hogans, the traditional Navajo homes, scattered across the landscape like little mounds of earth. Ahiga's clan lived in a valley about 2 miles from the river. There were perhaps 30 families, each with their own hogan and their own piece of land for their sheep and their gardens. It was a quiet, orderly place. The hogans were well built and well maintained. The sheep pens were sturdy. The cornfields were green and healthy despite the dry climate. These were people who knew how to live in this land. People who had been living in it for generations and had learned its secrets. When Ahiga rode into the valley with the girl walking behind him, people stopped what they were doing and stared. Women looked up from their weaving. Men paused in their work. Children froze in the middle of their games and watched with wide, curious eyes. A stranger in the valley was always an event. But a stranger who was clearly not Navajo, who was clearly a captive, who was clearly being brought home by one of their own warriors, that was something that would be talked about for a very long time. The first person to approach was Ahiga's mother. Her name was Naaki. She was a small woman with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun and a face that had been carved by decades of wind and sun into a map of deep lines and sharp angles. She had the same dark, intense eyes as her son, and when she looked at the girl standing behind Ahiga, those eyes narrowed with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. She spoke to Ahiga in rapid Navajo, her voice low and sharp. The girl could not understand the words, but she understood the tone. It was the tone of a mother who was not pleased. Ahiga answered calmly, his voice measured and respectful. The conversation went back and forth for several minutes, growing more heated on Naki's side and more patient on Ahiga's. Finally, Naki shook her head, muttered something under her breath, and walked away. But before she left, she glanced back at the girl one more time, and the look on her face was not unkind. It was worried. Ahiga led the girl to a small hogan at the edge of the settlement. It was simple, but clean. The floor was packed earth. The walls were made of logs and mud. A fire pit sat in the center, with a smoke hole cut into the domed roof above it. There were sheepskins piled against one wall for sleeping, a few clay pots for cooking, and a wooden frame for weaving that stood empty in the corner. He gestured for her to go inside. She hesitated at the doorway, her eyes moving quickly around the dim interior, checking for threats, looking for exits. It was a habit she had developed over the past weeks. Always be aware. Always know where you are. Always know how to get out. She stepped inside, and the cool dimness of the hogan wrapped around her like a blanket. After 3 days in the blazing sun, it felt like stepping into another world. Ahiga did not follow her in. He stood at the doorway and pointed to the sheepskins, and then to the cooking pots. His meaning was clear. Rest. Eat. Then he turned and walked away, leaving her alone for the first time since the trading post. She stood in the middle of the hogan and listened. She could hear the sounds of the valley drifting in through the doorway. Sheep bleating, dogs barking, children laughing, women singing as they worked. Normal sounds, safe sounds, sounds she had not heard in a very long time. Her throat tightened, her eyes burned, and for the first time since the night her village was destroyed, she cried. Not the quiet, silent tears she had learned to shed when no one was watching. Real crying. Deep, ugly, body-shaking sobs that came from a place so far inside her that she had not even known it existed. She cried for her father. She cried for her mother. She cried for the girl she had been before the raiders came. She cried until there was nothing left, until her body was empty and her eyes were dry and her throat was raw. Then she lay down on the sheepskins, pulled over her body, and fell into the deepest sleep she had had in weeks. When she woke up, the light coming through the doorway had changed. It was softer, golden, the light of late afternoon. She sat up and looked around. Someone had been in the hogan while she slept. A clay pot filled with stew sat near the fire pit, still warm. A bundle of clean clothing lay beside it. A deerskin dress, simple but well made, along with a pair of moccasins and a woven belt. She touched the dress with careful fingers. The leather was soft and supple, worked to a smoothness that spoke of skill and patience. Someone had taken time to make this, or at least to choose it for her. She ate the stew slowly, savoring each bite. It was thick and rich, made with mutton and corn and some kind of wild herb that she did not recognize but that tasted like the earth itself. When she was done, she changed into the clean clothing, running her hands over the deerskin as it settled against her skin. It fit well. Not perfectly, but well enough. She tied the belt around her waist and slipped her feet into the moccasins. Then she stepped outside. The valley was bathed in golden light. Long shadows stretched across the ground. Sheep moved in slow clusters across the hillside, their wool catching the last of the sun. An old man sat outside his hogan, carving something from a piece of wood. Two women walked together along the path, carrying bundles of firewood on their backs. A group of boys ran past, chasing a dog that had stolen a piece of meat from someone's fire. It was ordinary, wonderfully, beautifully ordinary, and it made her heart ache with a longing she could not name. Over the next few weeks, the girl began to learn the rhythms of the valley. She woke at dawn with the rest of the settlement. She helped tend the sheep, herding them out to the grazing land in the morning and bringing them back in the evening. She gathered firewood. She hauled water from the stream. She watched the women weave on their looms, and when they allowed her, she sat beside them and tried to learn. Her fingers were clumsy at first, fumbling with the threads, producing uneven lines that made the women smile and shake their heads. But she kept trying. And slowly, day by day, her work improved. She also began to learn the language. It was difficult. Navajo was nothing like the language she had grown up speaking. The sounds were different. The rhythm was different. The way words were built, layered on top of each other like stones in a wall, was unlike anything she had encountered. But she listened carefully. She repeated words under her breath. She watched the way people's mouths moved when they spoke. And gradually, like water seeping into dry ground, the language began to make sense to her. Ahiga came to see her every day. Sometimes he brought food. Sometimes he brought small gifts. A strand of turquoise beads. A comb carved from bone. A small pouch of dried herbs that smelled sweet when she held them to her nose. He never stayed long. He never pushed himself into her space. He would come, leave whatever he had brought, say a few words in his calm, steady voice, and then leave. It was as if he was building something, brick by brick, word by word, and he was willing to take as long as it needed. She did not know what to make of him. Her experience with men since the raid had been uniformly terrible. They had taken from her. They had used her. They'd traded her like a sack of grain. And now he was this man who had bought her at an auction, who owned her in the eyes of his people, and yet he treated her as if she were a guest rather than a possession. It confused her. It made her suspicious. She kept waiting for the other face to appear, the real face, the one that would show her what he truly wanted from her. But the other face never came. One evening, about a month after her arrival, she was sitting outside the hogan watching the sun go down when Ahiga appeared on the path. He walked up and sat down beside her, not too close, leaving a respectful distance between them. For a while, neither of them spoke. They just sat there, watching the sky change colors, listening to the sounds of the valley settling in for the night. Then Ahiga spoke. He spoke slowly, choosing his words with care, mixing Navajo with the few words of her language that he had managed to learn. He told her that she was not a slave. He told her that he had not bought her to own her. He told her that what he had seen on that platform, what he had felt when he first looked at her, was not the desire of a man looking at something he wanted to possess. It was something else, something deeper. Something he did not fully understand himself. He told her that she was free. Free to stay if she wanted. Free to leave if she wanted. Free to go back to wherever she had come from. If there was anything left to go back to, he would give her food and water and a horse and point her in the right direction, and he would not try to stop her. The choice was hers. She listened in silence, her face unreadable. When he finished, she stared at the horizon for a long time. The last sliver of sun was disappearing behind the mesas, painting the clouds in shades of blood and amber. She thought about her village. She thought about the stream, and the cornfield and her mother's loom. She thought about the smoke and the screams and the hands that had dragged her away from everything she loved. She had nowhere to go. She knew that. Even if her village still existed, even if some of her people had survived, the journey back would be long and dangerous, and she would have to cross the same territory where she had been captured. Alone, on foot, she would not last a week, and even if by some miracle she made it back, what would she find? Burned homes, empty fields, bones. But that was not the only reason she did not leave. There was something else, something she was not ready to admit to herself yet, something that had been growing quietly in the background of her days, like a seed planted in soil so dark and so deep that she had not even noticed it taking root. She turned and looked at Ahiga. In the fading light, his face was all shadows and angles, his dark eyes reflecting the last embers of the sunset. He looked back at her with an openness that she had never seen in any man's face before. There was no calculation in his eyes, no agenda, no hidden motive. Just a man sitting beside a woman, waiting for her to decide her own fate. She did not say yes. She did not say she would stay. She did not make any grand declaration or romantic speech. She simply turned back to the sunset, leaned just slightly in his direction, and let the silence say what words could not. Ahiga understood. He did not move closer. He did not reach for her hand. He just sat there beside her, breathing quietly, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. And somewhere in the stillness between them, a door opened, just a crack, just enough to let in a thin sliver of light. But it was enough. Not everyone in the valley was happy about the situation. Ahiga's mother, Naki, remained wary. She was not a cruel woman. She did not wish the girl harm, but she had lived long enough to know that bringing a stranger into the clan could cause problems. There were questions of loyalty, questions of trust, questions of whether this outsider would ever truly belong or whether she would always be a source of tension and whispered gossip. There were others in the valley who shared Naki's concerns. A warrior named Bidzil, who had grown up with Ahiga and considered himself a rival in all things, was particularly vocal. Bidzil was a proud man, quick to anger and slow to forgive, and he saw Ahiga's purchase of the captive girl as an insult to Navajo tradition. A real warrior, he said loudly and often, did not buy a wife at a slave auction. A real warrior earned his wife through deeds of courage and gifts to her family. What Ahiga had done was shameful, and the girl herself was nothing but damaged goods, a woman who had been handled by traders and raiders and who knew what else. These words reached Ahiga, as they were meant to, but he did not react. He went about his days as he always had, tending his sheep, riding his horse across the wide open land, sitting by the fire in the evening and carving small figures from pieces of juniper wood. If the whispers and the insults bothered him, he did not show it. His face remained calm. His manner remained steady. But those who knew him well could see something in his eyes that had not been there before. A determination, a quiet, unshakable resolve that said he would not be moved from his course, no matter what anyone said or did. The girl, too, heard the whispers. She could not understand all the words yet, but she understood enough. She understood that some people did not want her here. She understood that she was seen as an outsider, a problem, a stain on the honor of a good man. And she understood that her presence was putting Ahiga in a difficult position with his own people. This knowledge sat heavy on her shoulders. She had not asked to be brought here. She had not asked for any of this. She was a woman without a home, without a family, without a people. She was a leaf, blown by a wind she could not control, landing wherever the gusts took her. And now she had landed here, in this valley, in this man's life. And the wind was still blowing, but she kept working. She kept learning. She kept getting up every morning and doing what needed to be done. She helped with the sheep. She practiced her weaving. She began to form tentative connections with some of the women in the valley, the ones who were kind enough to smile at her and show her how things were done. She was building something, though she did not yet know what. A life, perhaps, or at least the foundation of one. And through it all, there was Ahiga, constant, patient, present. He did not push. He did not pull. He simply existed beside her, a steady presence in a world that had given her nothing but chaos. And slowly, so slowly that neither of them could pinpoint the exact moment it happened, the distance between them began to close. Not the physical distance, the other distance. The one measured not in steps but in trust. The crack in the door grew a little wider. The light coming through grew a little brighter, and the seed that had been planted in the dark earth of her heart pushed upward, reaching for something it could not yet see but somehow knew was there. It arrived without warning, the way winter does in the high desert. One day the sky was clear and blue and the air was warm enough to work without a blanket, and the next day the clouds rolled in from the north like a grey army, and the temperature dropped so fast that the water in the clay pots froze solid overnight. Snow fell thick and heavy, covering the valley in a white blanket that turned the familiar landscape into something strange and silent. The sheep huddled together in their pens, their wool dusted with frost. The cornfields disappeared under drifts of snow, and the people of the valley retreated into their hogans, stoking their fires high and waiting for the season to pass. For the girl, winter brought a new kind of challenge. The cold was fierce, sharper than anything she had known in her old valley, where the mountains had blocked the worst of the northern winds. Here, the wind blew straight across the open land and found every crack and gap in the walls of the hogan. She piled sheepskins around the edges. She kept the fire burning day and night. She learned to bank the coals just right so they would last through the long hours of darkness, and still there were mornings when she woke shivering, her breath coming out in white clouds, her fingers so stiff she could barely move them. But winter also brought something unexpected. It brought closeness. With the outdoor work limited to the bare essentials, feeding the animals, hauling firewood, breaking ice on the water troughs, the people of the valley spent more time together. They gathered in each other's hogans in the evenings, sharing food and stories and warmth. The old men told tales of the ancient times, stories about the hero twins and changing woman, and the creation of the Navajo world. The women worked on their weaving, their fingers moving with a speed and precision that never ceased to amaze the girl. The children played games on the packed earth floor, their laughter ringing out like small bells in the quiet of the winter night. The girl was invited to these gatherings, not always, not by everyone, but enough. Naki, Ahiga's mother, had softened toward her as the weeks passed. She had watched the girl work without complaint. She had seen her struggle with the language and the weaving and the thousand small tasks of daily life, and she had seen her refuse to give up. This impressed Naki, who valued determination above almost everything else. One evening, without a word of explanation, Naki had appeared at the girl's hogan carrying a large pot of stew and a bundle of extra blankets. She had set them down inside the door, looked at the girl for a long moment, then nodded once and left. It was not an embrace. It was not a declaration of acceptance, but it was a step, and they both knew it. Ahiga continued his daily visits, but now, with the cold pressing everyone closer together, his visits grew longer. He would sit by her fire in the evening, and they would talk. The conversations were slow and often funny, full of misunderstandings and wrong words and gestures that meant one thing in one culture and something completely different in another. She told him about her village, about the stream and the cornfield, and the way the light looked when it came through the canyon walls in the early morning. She told him about her mother's weaving, how the blankets were so tightly woven that they could hold water, and how her mother used to sing while she worked, songs so old that no one remembered who had first sung them. She told him about her father, his quiet strength, his wisdom, his belief that words were always better than weapons. Ahiga listened, the way he did everything with complete and focused attention. He did not interrupt. He did not compare her experiences to his own. He simply listened, and sometimes when she described something particularly beautiful or particularly painful, she could see his eyes change, deepening with an emotion that he did not try to hide. In return, he told her about his world. He told her about the Navajo way of life, the ceremonies and the prayers and the deep connection to the land that shaped everything his people did. He told her about the 4 sacred mountains that marked the boundaries of the Navajo homeland, and how the holy people had placed them there at the beginning of time as guardians and protectors. He told her about the long walk, the terrible forced march that the American soldiers had made his people endure years ago, driving them from their homeland to a barren wasteland far to the east, where hundreds had died of starvation and disease. And he told her about the return, how the survivors had walked back to their homeland with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the determination in their hearts, and how they had rebuilt everything from scratch, hogan by hogan, field by field, sheep by sheep, She listened to these stories with the same intensity that he gave to hers. And as the winter deepened and the snow piled higher and the world outside shrank to a small white circle of cold and silence, the world inside the hogan grew warmer and richer and more alive. One night, during a storm that shook the walls of the hogan and drove snow through every crack and crevice, Ahiga showed up at her door carrying extra firewood. The wind was howling so loud that she almost did not hear his knock. She opened the door and he stumbled in, covered in snow from head to foot, his face raw from the wind. She pulled the door shut behind him and helped him brush the snow from his clothes. His hands were shaking from the cold. She took them between her own hands and rubbed them until the circulation came back, until the blue tinge faded from his fingertips and the warmth returned. He looked at her while she did this. She looked at him. The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The storm raged outside, wild and furious, but inside the hogan there was stillness, a warm, deep stillness that seemed to come not from the walls or the fire, but from somewhere inside the two of them. She did not let go of his hands. He did not pull them away. And in that moment, with the wind screaming and the snow flying and the whole world trying to tear itself apart outside, something quiet and powerful settled into place between them. The door that had been cracked open all those weeks ago swung wide. The light that had been seeping through in thin slivers flooded in all at once, bright and warm and overwhelming. He stayed that night, not because the storm made it impossible to leave, though it did. He stayed because she asked him to. She did not use words. She simply held onto his hands and did not let go. And he understood. They sat by the fire all night, talking and not talking, sharing the warmth of the blankets and the fire and each other. When the storm finally died down in the early hours of the morning, the valley was buried under a thick layer of fresh snow. The world outside was white and quiet and new, as if the storm had washed everything clean and given them a fresh start. From that night on, everything changed. Not dramatically, not overnight, but steadily, like a river changing course, one grain of sand at a time. Ahiga began spending more and more time at her hogan. The gap between his home and hers closed, not physically but in every other way that mattered. The valley noticed, of course. "People always notice," the women whispered. The men exchanged knowing looks. Naki said nothing, but she began sending extra food to the girls' hogan. Enough for two. Bidzil, the rival warrior, grew louder in his complaints. He confronted Ahiga one morning near the sheep pens, his voice sharp and cutting, his words designed to wound. He called Ahiga a fool. He called the girl a burden. He said that no good could come from a union between a Navajo warrior and a foreign captive, that the spirits would be angered, that the clan would be weakened, that Ahiga was throwing away his honor for the sake of a pretty face. Ahiga let him talk. He stood there with his arms at his sides, his face calm, his eyes steady. When Bidzil finally ran out of words, Ahiga spoke. He spoke quietly, the way he always did, but there was a weight to his words that made Bidzil's loud bluster seem thin and hollow by comparison. He said that honor was not something that could be given or taken by another man's words. He said that strength was not measured by how loudly a man could shout, but by how quietly he could stand in the face of a storm. He said that the spirits did not punish a man for listening to his heart, and that the greatest warriors he had ever known were not the ones who fought the hardest, but the ones who loved the deepest. Then he turned and walked away, leaving Bidzil standing alone by the sheep pens, with a face like a thundercloud, and no one left to argue with. Spring came slowly, the way it always does in the high desert. The snow melted in stages, retreating up the hillsides like a white tide pulling back from the shore. The streams swelled with meltwater. The sage bushes put out new green growth. The sheep began to lamb, and the valley was filled with the sound of tiny, bleating voices and the sight of wobbly-legged newborns taking their first unsteady steps on the damp earth. The girl had changed over the winter. It was not just the language which she now spoke with growing confidence, mixing Navajo words with gestures and expressions in a way that was uniquely her own. It was not just the weaving which had improved dramatically under the patient guidance of Naki and the other women. It was something deeper, something fundamental. The fear that had been her constant companion since the night of the raid had not disappeared entirely, but it had receded, pushed back to a quiet corner of her mind where it no longer controlled her every thought and action. In its place, something new had grown, not quite peace, not quite happiness, but something close, something like belonging. She had a place now, It was small and fragile and still uncertain in many ways, but it was hers. She had her hogan. She had her loom. She had the daily rhythms of the valley, the feeding and the herding and the cooking and the weaving. She had the tentative friendships she had built with some of the women, the shared laughter over small things, the quiet solidarity that comes from doing hard work side by side. And she had Ahiga. Steady, patient, immovable Ahiga, who had never once made her feel like she owed him anything, who had never once reminded her that he had paid for her, who had never once treated her as anything less than an equal. She had started calling him by name, not the name the traders had used, or the name the other warriors called him, a different name. A private name that she had given him in her own language, a name that meant something only the two of them understood. And he had given her a name too. A Navajo name. He called her Nijoni. It meant beautiful. But not just beautiful in the way that the traders at the auction had seen her. Beautiful in the way that the morning is beautiful, or the first rain after a long dry season, or the sound of a child's laughter echoing off the canyon walls. Beautiful in a way that goes beyond the surface and reaches down into the heart of things. As the spring unfolded, Ahiga told his mother that he wanted to hold a ceremony, a proper Navajo wedding ceremony, conducted in the traditional way, with all the proper prayers and rituals and blessings. Naki listened to her son's request and was quiet for a long time. Then she asked him if the girl wanted this too. Ahiga said she did. Naki was quiet again. Then she nodded and began making preparations. The ceremony was held on a warm evening in late spring, when the valley was green and the wild flowers were blooming and the air smelled like sage and rain. It was not a large event. No distant relatives traveled from other clans. No grand feast was prepared. It was a simple ceremony, witnessed by the families of the valley and presided over by an old medicine man who had been performing weddings since before most of the people there had been born. The girl wore a new dress that Nayaki had helped her make. It was white deerskin, decorated with turquoise beads along the neckline and sleeves. Her hair was washed and brushed and hung loose past her shoulders, shining like black silk in the firelight. Ahiga wore his finest clothing as well, a new shirt of soft leather and his best turquoise necklace, the one his father had given him before he died. They sat facing each other across a basket of cornmeal, which is the traditional symbol of nourishment and life in the Navajo way. The medicine man sang the wedding songs, his voice rising and falling in the ancient patterns that had been handed down from generation to generation for longer than anyone could remember. The songs spoke of harmony, of balance, of the joining of two lives into one. They spoke of the beauty way, the Navajo concept that the world is meant to be beautiful, and that it is the duty of every person to walk through it in beauty and in balance. When the songs were finished, the girl and Ahiga each took a pinch of cornmeal from the basket and ate it. This was the moment that bound them together. Not a kiss, not an exchange of rings, just two people sharing a simple food under a vast and star-filled sky, promising in their own quiet way to walk the rest of their path together. Naki watched the ceremony with wet eyes. She did not cry openly. That was not her way. But those who sat near her could see the moisture shining on her weathered cheeks. Beside her sat Ahiga's younger sister, a bright-eyed girl of 16, who had taken an immediate liking to the newcomer, and who clapped her hands with delight when the ceremony was completed. Even Bidzil was there, standing at the back of the gathering with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, but present nonetheless, which was as close to approval as anyone was likely to get from him. After the ceremony, there was food and music and dancing. Nothing extravagant, just corn cakes and mutton stew and the sweet sticky cakes made from ground pine nuts that were a special treat reserved for important occasions. One of the men had a drum, and another had a flute, and they played together while people danced in a wide circle around the fire, their shadows leaping and swaying on the walls of the hogans. The girl danced. For the first time since the night of the raid, she let the music move her body. She danced with the women in the traditional way, stepping in time with the drum, her moccasined feet striking the packed earth in a rhythm that was ancient and powerful and alive. And as she danced, she felt something break free inside her. The last chain, the last lock, the last piece of the cage that captivity had built around her heart. It shattered and fell away, and what was left was not the girl who had been dragged from her burning village, or the woman who had stood on the auction platform with bound wrists and burning eyes. What was left was someone new, someone who had been forged in the fire of suffering and had come out on the other side, Not unscathed, not unmarked, but whole. She danced until she was breathless. Then she stopped and looked across the fire and saw Ahiga watching her with those steady, dark eyes that had been the first thing she saw on the morning her life changed. He was smiling, not a big, wide, showy smile, a quiet smile, a smile that lived more in his eyes than on his mouth, a smile that said, "I see you, all of you. And you are enough." She walked around the fire to where he stood. She reached out and took his hand. And this time, instead of holding it to warm his cold fingers, she held it simply because she wanted to. Because his hand in hers felt like the most natural thing in the world. The months that followed were the happiest she had ever known. She settled into the life of the valley with a completeness that surprised even herself. She became skilled at weaving, producing blankets that drew admiring looks from the other women, and that Naoki praised with a grunt and a nod, which everyone knew was Naoki's highest form of compliment. She learned to cook the Navajo way, mastering the art of making fry bread and muffin stew, and the delicate blue corn porridge that was Ahiga's favorite. She tended the sheep with growing confidence, learning to read the weather by watching the clouds and the wind and the way the animals behaved. And in the quiet hours of the evening, when the work was done and the fire was burning low and the valley was settling into its nightly silence, she would sit with Ahiga outside their hogan and watch the stars appear one by one in the deepening sky. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they sat in comfortable silence. Sometimes she would lay her head on his shoulder and close her eyes and let the peace of the moment wash over her like warm water. She was not naive. She knew that the world outside the valley was still dangerous. She knew that raiders still rode the open country. She knew that slave traders still operated at the edges of the territory. She knew that the American soldiers were building forts and roads, and that the old ways were being squeezed tighter with every passing year. She knew that nothing was permanent, that safety was an illusion, that the peace she had found could be shattered just as easily as the peace of her old village had been shattered on that terrible night. But she also knew something else. She knew that you cannot refuse to live simply because life might be taken from you. She knew that love is not less valuable because it might be lost. She knew that the fire burns just as bright whether it lasts an hour or a lifetime. And she knew that the choice to be happy, truly happy, in the face of all the pain and all the loss and all the uncertainty, was the bravest thing a person could do. In the autumn of that year, she told Ahiga that she was carrying a child. He received the news with the same quiet steadiness that he brought to everything, but she could see the joy underneath, shining through his calm exterior like sunlight through thin clouds. He held her hands, and his grip was a little tighter than usual, and when he spoke his voice was a little rougher than usual, and she knew that this man, this warrior who had faced raiders and wolves and storms without flinching, was overwhelmed with a happiness so big that he did not quite know what to do with it. Naki, when she heard the news, did something that shocked everyone in the valley. She smiled, a real, full, genuine smile that transformed her weathered face and revealed the beautiful young woman she must have been decades ago. Then she immediately began giving orders, organizing the women to prepare clothing and blankets for the baby, consulting with the medicine man about the proper ceremonies and blessings, and generally taking charge of the situation in the way that only a Navajo grandmother can. The girl watched all of this with a heart so full it felt like it might burst. She stood outside her hogan on a cool autumn morning, one hand resting on her stomach, and looked out at the valley that had become her home. The sheep dotted the hillside like clouds that had fallen to earth. The corn in the fields was tall and golden, ready for harvest. The smoke from the cooking fires rose straight up into the still air, thin white columns connecting the earth to the sky. And in the distance, the sacred mountains stood, as they always had, ancient and unchanging, watching over the land and the people who lived on it. She thought about her journey, the burning village, the long, terrible ride south, the trading posts and the camps and the rough hands and the bound wrists, the auction platform, the shouting crowd, and then the voice that had cut through it all like a blade of light through darkness, the voice of a man she did not know, buying her freedom with everything he had. She thought about the first time she had drunk water from his cupped hands, the first time she had heard him say her name, the first time she had let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, the world was not entirely made of cruelty and loss, that somewhere in all the wreckage there was something worth saving, something worth building, something worth loving. She was not the girl from the burning village anymore. She was not the captive on the platform. She was not the frightened woman who had walked behind a stranger's horse across 3 days of empty desert. She was Najoni. She was a wife. She was going to be a mother. She was a weaver, a herder, a member of a clan, a daughter-in-law who had earned the respect of the toughest mother-in-law in the valley. She was all of these things, and she was none of them, because beneath all the names and the roles and the identities, she was simply a woman who had survived, a woman who had been broken and who had put herself back together piece by piece, in a new shape that was different from the original but no less whole. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of sage and wood smoke, and the distant, clean scent of snow from the mountains. She pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders and felt the baby move inside her, a tiny flutter, like a bird trying its wings for the first time. She smiled, not the careful, guarded smile she had learned to use in the months after the raid, a real smile, one that started deep in her chest and spread outward like the warmth of a fire, reaching all the way to her eyes and lighting them up from the inside. Behind her, she heard footsteps on the packed earth. She did not need to turn around to know who it was. She knew his walk the way she knew her own heartbeat. He came up beside her and stood there, looking out at the same view she was looking at, seeing the same mountains and the same sky and the same beautiful, imperfect, fragile world. He did not say anything. He did not need to. He simply stood beside her, solid and warm and present, the way he had been standing beside her since the day he first saw her on that dusty platform, and said the words that changed everything. She reached out and took his hand. He closed his fingers around hers, and together, in the golden light of an autumn morning, they stood at the edge of the life they had built and looked forward into whatever was coming next. They did not know what it would be. They did not know if it would be easy or hard, joyful or painful, long or short. They only knew that they would face it together. And for two people who had already survived the worst the world could throw at them, that was more than enough. The mountains stood watch. The wind carried its ancient song, and somewhere in the valley below, a new life was beginning, small and fragile and full of possibility, reaching toward the light the way all living things do, stubborn and hopeful and refusing, absolutely refusing, to be anything less than alive.